Thanks so much, James, and thanks to the Royal Society for inviting me and for everyone for staying to listen to this, what is quite a different type of session to ones you've had before. I'm going to actually try and bridge a little bit, moving on from what Francois was saying about how people and how often as researchers we think about the social factors that we think are associated with the development of these disorders and how that links or could link potentially through the biology to actually influence the development of these actual symptoms themselves and how people experience them. So I'm going to focus on one of many, many potential pathways, and I'll emphasize that because I was saying to someone yesterday, these mental health problems are really multifactorial. We don't really understand. We've been looking at them for, well, maybe even millennia, and we still don't really understand them. So we're kind of trying to get to grips, and so I'm just going to present one very small piece of a very large puzzle. Okay, so what I'm actually going to do is just start by defining some of the terms I'm going to use. I'll just flag at the beginning that all of the different things, whether we're talking about environmental exposure or we're talking actually about psychosis as well as the mechanistic bit, are all really difficult to define. They're very difficult to measure because we can't nicely experiment with them and define them in a puristic way. They're often observational, relying on people actually telling us what they're experiencing and us being able to elicit that from them and define it in a certain way. And the terms that we use to define it are socially constructed. We can't give them a test. I can't give them a test at the moment to say this person has definitely been sexually abused or this person definitely has schizophrenia. These are all socially constructed terms. So I think it's just really important to, when you're listening to the kind of things that we're presenting, to be kind of aware of the critical perspective. You need to have a critical perspective when you think about it because people measure things and talk about things in very different ways. So when I'm talking about early adversity, I'm going to focus more on traumatic or what we might consider potentially traumatic experiences. So these still cover quite a broad range of things, so things like sexual abuse, so often things like rape or molestation, physical abuse, so being repeatedly hit to the point of injury, so we're not talking about little mild smacking of children, we're talking about something much more extreme, physical or emotional neglect, so children being deprived of enough food, not just because of poverty, but because the parent is purposefully depriving them of food or clean clothes, as well as depriving them of love and emotional safety, as well as emotional and psychological abuse, so at the extremes, the thing you see in Hollywood often, so shutting a child in a shed at the end of the garden and throwing away the key and them not seeing daylight, as well as just very hostile parenting. So these are, as you can already tell, quite a broad range of different types of experiences. We also consider under this umbrella things like bullying by peers, by other people of a similar age to you, often at school, as well as actually sometimes your siblings at home, the death or separation from a parent, witnessing domestic violence, and also exposure to war, natural disasters, and serious accidents. So this is a huge umbrella term, and I'm going to focus mainly on forms of maltreatment such as sexual and physical abuse in this talk. So just to give you some data, to give a little bit of context, I find it very interesting that certainly in the UK, and I'm not sure about other parts of the world, but we have started to talk, the discourse in the media and other places is to talk a lot about abuse nowadays. We had a big case of Jimmy Savile, who was a celebrity, who was shown to have abused a lot of people, and that came out in the media, and since then people have talked about this a lot. So I think we're aware it's more prevalent than we might have liked to have think. This is some data from 2009, published in 2013, which is a representative sample of kids, several thousand kids across the UK. And these are the kind of rates that were found in that sample. So actually up to a quarter of children were suggested either by their parents or themselves to have been maltreated in some way by their parents. And you might think that rate is very high, again, speaks a bit to definition. But not surprisingly, perhaps the highest rate was around neglect, so physical and emotional forms of deprivation. Sexual abuse by parents is pretty rare in these kind of samples. Perhaps as worrying or more worrying, about 2/3 of kids were reported to have been bullied by their peers. 1 in 10 or so were experienced some form of contact sexual abuse, and actually that was most commonly in this sample by someone of a similar age to them, not by their uncle or a stranger. about a quarter were witnessing domestic violence at home, and about 2/3 were witnessing violence in their community. So kids, unfortunately, exposed to quite a wide range of different types of violence, although note, though, that these are not mutually exclusive. So often, unfortunately, what happens is a child will be exposed to multiple types of victimization. So there are a group of kids who tend to, unfortunately, get most of the exposure. Okay, so just to clarify, so James went a bit over what we mean by psychosis earlier, but just to be clear that in this talk I'm going to talk quite specifically about psychotic symptoms rather than necessarily schizophrenia or a specific clinical disorder. And so as James said, what we're thinking about here are hallucinations. So these can be hearing or seeing things that other people don't, as well as feeling things that people don't. So often things like spiders running underneath your skin, or smelling unusual things like rotting flesh. So people can have all sorts of different types, or tasting poison that you think food is being poisoned. You can often taste that. So very unusual types of things. Also delusional beliefs, so paranoia, believing that people are going to hurt you or that you have some kind of special ability, as well as James was describing, sometimes often disorganized speech or difficulty in actually forming words or having thoughts at all. So sometimes people can have a complete thought block or quite erratic forms of behavior. So I'm going to focus a bit more on these than on the kind of negative symptoms in what I do, because they're much easier to assess. And as James said, these symptoms occur in different things, but just to clarify that actually I'm going to look, because I'm looking in general population samples, normally at these symptoms when they occur outside of a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. So psychotic symptoms actually occur more frequently in the population than you might think, more commonly than schizophrenia. So depending on how you measure it, 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 adults in the general population might say that they actually hear a voice, not always all the time, but they can actually get on and do a job whilst hearing a voice. And in children, we see around 11 or 12, maybe 1 in 20 kids actually having these different types of symptoms. As James alluded to, though, we do see them quite commonly in schizophrenia. We also see them in people with depression and bipolar disorder and various forms of personality disorders. But as many of you may know, I think someone was alluding to yesterday, but back in the day they may have tried, obviously various substances can also elicit these types of experiences, as well as if you have a really high temperature, if you're sleep deprived. I think not enough of us are jet lagged enough to have these symptoms yet, but if you maybe have had a child, maybe you've experienced some of this. If you have obviously injured certain parts of the brain, or if you have dementia. So these are actually symptoms that transcend quite a lot of diagnostic boundaries, as well as occurring outside of diagnosis. Okay, so this is a forest plot that Kelly was referring to earlier, and I won't go through all this evidence, but this is basically summarizing quite a large number of studies that have looked at the association between different forms of childhood adversity, particularly physical, sexual, and emotional types of abuse and bullying, and experiencing both psychotic symptoms in general populations as well as psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia. And people have used quite a wide range of study designs to do this, and the general scientific belief, if you like, in the kind of world that we work in, is that if you can find similar results in different types of study design, it points to the potential fact, I think it's probably a bit far, points to the suggestion that these things are probably associated with each other. And so that's the kind of suggestion from this literature. What it doesn't do, because it's observational, is tell us really if one causes the other. We can kind of get a sense of temporality, that the abuse probably occurred before the symptoms appeared, but we can't entirely tell that the abuse caused the psychosis to occur. Okay. So we'll take that as a given for the moment. We can discuss it later. But as we were hearing earlier, whether it be migration or discrimination or particular types of abuse, we believe that these are associated in some way with these psychotic phenomena. But the issue for me particularly is that I'm studying abuse that occurs often before the age of 12, but I'm not seeing the emergence of psychotic symptoms until kind of adolescence or a little bit later. So that time lag is a little bit difficult to explain. You would expect something like PTSD, you would often have a trauma and you almost, in the first few weeks, have a stress reaction to it. And the prolongingness of that is what diagnoses you with PTSD. You can get delayed reaction, but it's slightly less common. But with psychotic symptoms, we're talking about months, years, even sometimes a decade for this association. So what we're assuming is that there are other mechanisms in play that perhaps are taking toll over a period of time that are explaining how these things can be linked to each other. And as I say, there are different ways we can do that, and we can look at different levels. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the kind of psychological level of how these things are associated. And I'm going to specifically think about a biological level today, but those levels are not necessarily exclusive of each other, just measuring things in different planes, if you like. So the one I'm going to look at today, which is something that social scientists particularly, perhaps more than biologists, are excited about, is something called epigenetics, which you may or may not know much about. And this is just one way to define it, which I put in red the most important points, which is the reversible, we believe it's reversible, regulation of gene expression mediated principally through changes in DNA methylation and chromatin structure, which occur independently of the DNA sequence. So this is a biological phenomenon that's been around, obviously, for a very long time, because it's occurring within us all the time. But people have thought about this for quite a long time. And the idea being really that your DNA sequence, your genetic sequence, is pretty much, most of the time, stable across your life, unless something particularly happens. But around that, if you like, is almost a chemical layer that's making decisions about when those genes are expressed. So in essence, it's deciding whether we're turning on or turning off, to varying degrees, those particular genes. So just to give you an analogy, to make it a bit easier, about the kind of connection between these things. So if you like, if we think about an orchestral performance of a classical piece of music, your genotype, if you like, your genes are the actual score that the composer has written. The phenotype, or the psychotic expression, if you like, for us is the music you hear when you sit and listen to the orchestra play the piece, and the epigenome is the bit that the conductor has sat and actually decided this is exactly how we're going to do this, and this is how it's going to be played out. So it's kind of orchestrating the translation of your DNA sequence into the expression outside. That's a very simplistic way, but hopefully gives you a bit of a feel for it, for what we're looking at. And as I say, this is a normal process that's happening within us. It's the process that decides when we have a cell, whether that's going to go on and become a neuron or a muscle cell or a skin cell, what it's going to do. It's the process that's happening to decide that your genes that are going to regulate puberty, the release of those particular hormones, when they're going to actually happen, how much of it's going to happen exactly when it is going to happen, and different processes that are going on through the body. And really, I mean, it's not quite as simple as turning things on and off, but it's kind of fine-tuning the functioning of your genes. And the exciting thing, we think, from a social science perspective, is this is one way that things like the environment and other things outside, as well as internal factors, can influence the regulation of genes. We always thought this is a very static process, and you're kind of stuck with what you've got. And so I'm going to just focus on data that relates to a very specific form of epigenetic process. There are many, which is DNA methylation. So this is the covalent transfer of a methyl group to the C5 position on the right there, of a cytosine ring within DNA, which is almost locking in and silencing that particular part of the gene. And we really look at this one because it's the easiest one to measure. The technology allows us to do this much easier than other forms of epigenetic factors. Okay, so people are particularly interested in environmental influences on epigenetic profiles because it's much easier to add and take away those methyl groups than it is to actually change the actual DNA sequence. And we consider this kind of epigenetic process to be very dynamic. And therefore, it's a way that the organism, your internal organism, if you like, as humans, we can respond to the environment without changing our hardware, without changing the genetic sequence. And these epigenetic marks are considered heritable as cells develop, and also are thought to be, from both animal models and a little bit in human models, to be quite sensitive to the environments we're exposed to. So it's one possible mechanism that might be happening. And people are starting to look at a variety of different environments, and it's quite possible that these are all in some way influencing what's happening internally to us. So some of these you can see are a little bit more obvious than others, so things like smoking, things like cancer. You know, we think that the reason that smoking leads to cancer is because of the chemicals you're taking into your body, and that's altering what's happening in your genetic sequence. So we all have genes that suppress the growth of tumors within us, but if those particular chemicals come in, that can take off, if you like, that methyl group from that gene, and actually those tumors can then start to grow. So stress is a little bit different when we're thinking about trauma. It's not quite so obvious, but one way it could work, and again, this is supposition because it's very difficult to test this in a human population. If you're exposed to a stressful experience, whether that be abuse or discrimination or something else, you're inevitably going, well, not always, but often if you think and perceive it to be a stressful experience, you will experience a biological stress reaction as well as a psychological one. So we will always have an increase in cortisol once we feel stressed, and an activation of the HPA axis. It's going to allow us to deal with that stress. And if that persisted, and that cortisol particularly circulating for too long or too often, you might expect that excess of the cortisol might have an impact on our epigenome and start altering eventually, through a long process, how our genes are expressed. And eventually, and this is the main supposition that we don't really know much about, if our genes are expressed in different ways, particularly at certain times in our life. So you can imagine as the brain is developing, either in the fetus or actually in early adolescence, when there's a lot of extra brain development happening, particularly that particular genes expressed in certain ways might change the way that the brain actually develops, so changing things like the hippocampus. So we were talking yesterday about emotional regulation. If you're changing actually what's happening in the hippocampus, that can be important. It can change the regulation of certain neurotransmitters, such as dopamine in the brain, which is important in psychosis because we think dopamine is important in assigning salience to certain things. So we think things around us are more salient. I think someone moving in a particular way is relevant to me, and I then become more paranoid about what's happening, and a variety of other neural processes that we think might lead to these psychotic symptoms. So, as I say, it's difficult to study these things in humans, because really we'd like to take out someone's brain and check it and put it back again and let them carry on with development, and we can't do that, thankfully, at this point. So we try and do more natural types of experiments. So we, as James was explaining, we follow people over time, and I particularly follow twins because they provide a nice design in that I can take monozygotic twins who are genetically identical, so I can control the genetic effects on their behaviors and what they are exposed to. And I can see if they're discordant for certain exposures or psychotic symptoms, do they have differences in what's happening in their epigenome. So this is a study in England and Wales, and we followed just over 2,000 kids, so just over 1,000 pairs, who were born in 94 to 95. And we've assessed them at various time points to get different ideas of when they were exposed to things, when symptoms developed. And the nice thing with this study is we've retained almost all the sample. So we're not losing people because they happen to be mentally unwell or exposed to particularly difficult things. And it's mainly representative of at least the socioeconomic distribution in the UK. And we've assessed them, as I say, at various points in childhood around different forms of abuse, so mainly asking their mums and then also themselves, particularly around things like bullying. We've taken buccal swabs, so I can come back to how we look at the DNA later if you want. We take buccal swabs from the kids at different points, so we can see these changes in the epigenetics. And we also ask the kids, when they get to around 12, about the psychotic experiences they're having. So just to say that in this sample, we've shown that if you're exposed to bullying by peers or you were maltreated physically by your parents, or physically abused, your risk of having psychotic symptoms was much higher than if you hadn't had these experiences, and if you had both exposures, it was even worse. And this is, you can also see if you just looked at accidents, which are traumatic in themselves, but not, there's no intent necessarily behind it. It's a little bit raised, but not much. So it's about the intention, we think, that's important. So just to say, so we've looked at the DNA methylation, the degree of DNA methylation at different points across the genome in these twins. So these are twins where one twin, so these genetically identical twins, one twin has been bullied and the other hasn't. And these are just bars. These are for each twin pair. So the one in light grey, if you like, is the unbullied twin, and the darker one is the bullied twin, and these are just showing how different they are at certain points in the genome in terms of the degree of methylation that you're seeing. And they don't differ all the time, but you can see around certain points they are differing to a degree. So there seems to be some differentiation between them. And this is, again, not so easy to see, but this is taking twins where one twin has psychotic symptoms at 12 and the other doesn't. And these are, again, by pair, and you can see that there are differences at certain points in the genome between these twins. Okay, but unfortunately what we haven't been able to do yet is look at the actual mediation in this sample, which we will, but it's expensive and it's taking quite a long time in the lab to do that. So at the moment, our suggestion is that these very basic results at different points suggest that actually it's possible that some DNA methylation patterns could be explaining how we get from bullying to psychotic symptoms, but that is yet to be clear. So we will look at that soon. Okay, so I will just summarize what was a fairly tentative, speculative talk, just to say that what I've tried to show you very briefly was that exposure to various forms of trauma is associated with psychotic symptoms in this very general population sample, and that it's possible that the biological stress reaction that people have to this might impact on the epigenetic processes that are happening all the time in our bodies, and that might impact on gene expression and then subsequently impact on brain function and development and lead to the development of those psychotic symptoms. But we need to directly test that, which we're trying to do. Obviously, there are also genetic influences on both the epigenome and your environmental exposure, which we try to pull out when we're looking at those monozygotic twins. There are issues, huge issues around tissue specificity. So I'm taking the epigenetic processes I see from buccal cells. You could look at blood, but I'm looking at psychotic symptoms that happen in the brain. And the epigenetic processes are not necessarily in tandem across the body. So it's quite a big leap. And also to say, as I tried to say at the beginning, we think there are probably quite a wide range of environmental exposures and mechanisms at various levels of a human that are likely to be involved. So this is just one possibility. So thank you for your attention, and thank you obviously to all the people involved and all the funding that's required. Thank you.
So do you sometimes find that both twins are psychotic, or is it always just one?
So we know that there is a genetic component to psychosis as well as the psychotic symptoms to the level of disorder. So it's much more common for both twins. If one twin has, it's more common for the other twin to also have these experiences. So you have to, within that, then pull apart where they are discordant. So that's a more unusual thing to find.
And is it more common with, are they identical twins or sometimes non-identical?
Sure, so in the sample we have both. In the studies I showed you, we're using the identical ones just to be able to control for the genetic relatedness of them entirely. But you see in this sample, and you see in many other studies, that it's inevitably more common if you're an identical twin to have schizophrenia or psychosis if your twin does, than if you're in a non-identical pair, which gives us the indication that there is a genetic factor. I was saying to someone last night, what people have not been able to find is specific genetic markers of psychosis. People have tried, and it's inevitably going to be thousands of genes of very, very small effect, and people are trying to add those together into polygenic risk scores to predict what's going on. But there is something genetic going on, but it's very difficult to pull apart what that is.
Thank you.
Oh!
Thank you. So your comments made me think of all the Syrian refugees that our countries are taking, and especially with the comment about homelessness, because I understand that's one of the issues, that they're still looking for homes for a lot of the refugees. So I just wonder to all three of you if you have any comments on what's happening, and also if you're able to follow these refugees to enhance your understanding.
Who wants to take that?
I don't.
That's almost an example of, I would not say necessarily the word, but I was going to say an experiment, but it's almost like something which is happening, right now as we speak, and we're, it's the biggest, I think, mass migration since the Second World War, but probably the only one that we can actually, that we will see unfold, and how to monitor this and that is quite unclear. What we know is that one of the first things, now we don't necessarily know that much yet in terms of psychosis. So homelessness is a relatively new thing with regards to, in terms of the etiology of psychosis or schizophrenia. We know that many homeless people, if we look at a sample of homelessness, lots of people will have a psychotic disorder or schizophrenia, but we usually think of this because of the illness and there's some sort of drift where people end up being homeless. We don't usually think of it as something that will lead to psychosis, but I think that's something that we need to change and to look at, and this is definitely something that could be, that could be part of the public health problem that we should look at. We definitely know that in terms of trauma, we know a little more about, refugees and trauma, and that's one of the first things that is protective for mental health. It's, the basic needs. One of them is having a roof, feeling safe that you're not going to be hurt or killed during the night, and the rest is some sort of social support or having peers. So that we already know is protective for post-traumatic stress reaction. So I think we can presume that it's also protective for later psychotic or more severe type of mental illnesses. So whatever we can do to address these needs rapidly is probably a good intervention. But we need to think beyond those lines. And there's something that when I think about how our field needs to get translated into policies, so you mentioned the notion of ethnic density, for instance. So that's something that it seems like the more you live, the more your ethnic group represents a large proportion of your neighborhood, the less is your risk of later mental health problems. We're not too sure why, but perhaps because of the social capital, perhaps as a buffer against discrimination, racism. I mean, we're not too sure. But it might have implications in the way that we're dealing with refugees now. I'm just thinking about the way that it's happening in Quebec. It has been a process of, well, okay, I'm going to take a few, and you're going to take a few, and it becomes sort of a policy, well, let's put 35 there, and 25 there, and 35 there, and is this the best way? So yes, one of them is, to get the roof, address the basic needs, but socially also, is this what is most protective? I don't think our type of evidence is yet into these kind of policy discussions.
Is anyone else from the panel?
I just think that these people have experienced over time a cumulative amount of traumatic and stressful experiences. That means that they're going to be at huge risk potentially for a variety of mental health problems, more immediate ones, more likely to be PTSD and depression than psychosis, but I think they are going to have a lot of needs in that way, and I can't imagine that we're really, if we're not even really, we're almost in denial that we're, certainly in the UK, we're in huge denial about having to take them and deal with them, and I think if we're not even going to be able to deal with the basic stuff, I think it's unlikely we're going to have a mental health response as well, but I think it is something that we need to think about, and there are charitable organisations that already deal on a lower, with smaller refugee populations and trafficked populations around that, but I think they're going to be overwhelmed by this, so I think it's something that we should be dealing with and will become a huge issue for us.
Well, in terms of your question regarding following these people up, I don't think we have really very good evidence on how long that latency period is between, migrating and having these consequences for psychotic disorder. So, it could be decades before we start to see some of these sort of longer-term mental health consequences, aside from the more acute mental health consequences of PTSD and depression that we might see initially.
Great. I think there are a couple more questions. One here.
So I've heard some interesting discussions around setting up computer networks within refugee camps, and usually this is discussed from a very technical perspective, that there's a very narrow connection up to the internet, and so what is it that's going along that pipe, and what can we prioritize and what we can't. And one of the things they find is that everybody wants to access Facebook, which clogs the entire pipe, and the person they're trying to talk to is on the other side of the refugee camp. And so there's all this work from a networking perspective, computer networking, trying to essentially replicate Facebook client on one side of this network to enable this communication. And I'm now wondering how much of an impact that would actually have on later mental health if you could actually enable some of these more technologies that help someone build and maintain social networks within the camp and possibly reduce the risks later on. And I'm kind of curious what sort of impacts that might have. I realize it's a guess.
I think we don't know specifically, but I think there's a huge amount of literature on a more controversial term, which is resilience, more generally to mental health and other problems later, and social support and social connectedness is a huge part of that. So I think that can only be a good thing. But we don't, when people haven't specifically looked at that kind of connectedness, but from the broader literature, one would assume that would be a really useful protective factor for some people.
What I would say also with regards to that is that, I mean, it's very interesting, and I see that as a clinical psychiatrist. I mean, what happens on Facebook is now, you know, it is a stressor in itself, and the griefs and the relationships that are broken on Facebook have real impact. And, you know, I receive people who do develop like grief, or I might not say psychotic reactions, but certainly suicidal feelings as a result of things that have happened. And the issue of cyber intimidation is part of this. So, so it is definitely a new way of it's a new social space that we need to think about, and it might have some positive effects in some ways in terms of feeling support and network. And I think we see that sometimes, you know, when there are Facebook reactions and people, let's all support the people who are going through this at this point. And, you know, people are perceiving that. They can perceive a sense of support, but it can also have negative consequences and experience trauma, and it can have other kind of impacts. So, yeah.
Although I would say just quickly, so in the data that we looked at with the twins, well, we've been following them, we've followed them actually up to 18 now. And interesting, we look at a lot of different types of victimization in them, but actually the cyber victimization, we were particularly interested because it's a hot topic at the moment. But interestingly, there were, I think out of several hundred of them who'd experienced cyber victimization, there were only about 10 of them who had not experienced offline victimization. So it was just almost like an extension. I'm not saying it's, you know, it doesn't necessarily make it probably is worse to a degree, but it was actually, you know, just one way that people were bullying them, and it was not just the only thing. But yeah, I think we have to, as we were talking about earlier with environmental, climate-related things, we have to also think that social environments, there are upsides and downsides to interventions.
I find it fascinating how the content of hallucinations and delusions will take on modern day things around us, like for example, Facebook being a new way in which people can experience trauma. A few years ago, a philosopher, you might know Ian Gold, and his brother, who's a psychiatrist practicing in New York, wrote an article for the New York Times entitled "The Truman Show Delusion," and it was all motivated by the fact that his brother in New York, as a practicing psychiatrist, had seen so many patients come through his doors describing the Truman Show delusion. They believed that this film was the answer to exactly what they'd been going through. And I find it very interesting how modern culture and society can actually have an impact on the content and the form of people's delusions and hallucinations afterwards. Makes sense. Do you want to come back on that?
Well, just quickly on that, but what you say, it's just that it came up in some of the narratives, actually, that I said, because of the discourse and all what happens on security and monitoring and surveillance also, you know, which is going on, and part of, you know, this crisis now as well at many levels, and some people will say that, and some of the groups, especially, you know, from Muslims' origin, who would say, well, you know, I've got that sense that I'm kind of being followed or monitored. Well, you know, there's a component of truth that there's a higher level of monitoring, and you know, so you're kind of pushing a little bit towards the line of psychosis, where is it not psychosis anymore? And so there's, I think, that phenomenon happening as well, and probably as well that the media, social media, are part of this as well, things that we need to take into account.
Absolutely. I think there's a few more questions. It's going to be a long shot for you. Yeah. Nicely done.
Thanks. I was just wondering, because you mentioned the kind of socially constructed nature of, you know, what's a disorder on a spectrum of symptoms, and how do, you know, how is that defined in terms of a clinical diagnosis, but also how the people themselves see that. I was wondering if maybe some of you could reflect on how cross-cultural your findings are. Are they just highly, you know, we're talking about the UK and Canada, and it's just so specific, or are these really generalizable given that kind of socially constructed nature of how people experience and categorize mental health?
So I think I'll probably let Francois answer this, but I would just say, so people have done studies. They've been studies from a Western perspective. So we do have, there are manuals that try to categorize these things. There is an American one, and there's also a World Health Organization one that's used across different countries in the world. So people have tried, I think, as much as they can to categorize things that cut across countries, but they have taken a Western perspective, and they've tried to go into it. They did do big studies where they went into other countries to try and measure the level of psychotic symptoms and schizophrenia, but those are coming from a Western perspective and the way that we want to conceptualize those. So there are a lot of people doing work in various villages and populations in different countries that have very different perceptions. And people, you know, we consider hallucinations, a lot of people will hear voices, as I say, without any problems, and it becomes a matter then within society. It becomes problematic because you can't work and you can't look after yourself, because those are things that we value within our society. Whereas in other cultures, because I can hear a voice, I'm closer to the spirits and God, and actually I'm going to become a healer and someone revered within my community. So it's a very complicated, but Francois has done some work. I don't know if you want to say.
Well, it is a very interesting topic, and I think the discussion in transcultural psychiatry initially focused a lot on depression, because the very notion of depression is perhaps more developed in Western world, but you would not have any equivalent words in some, you know, indigenous population, or even in China. You would have other kind of syndromes, perhaps more somatization, or talks about neurasthenia and things like that. The very process of applying, so it is known that there's that tendency of applying Western construct to elsewhere, and it's a bit like you have your cookie cutter, and you go into all sorts of other places, and if you just look through the cookie cutter, you'll be able to cut or find the disease in some ways that will fit, you know, the mold that you've done, but you might actually completely miss what this experience means, and it may not mean the same thing at all from a different. So cultural psychiatry and anthropology have always been quite critical about this. And in schizophrenia, for different reasons, but that's a bit what has been done in the large studies in the 1970s and 1980s, sort of looking everywhere at the same thing. And the conclusion was, haha, we find it everywhere, and all those symptoms are in all cultures. So yes, there's probably, there's some symptoms and some forms of human distress, such as, you know, delusions, hallucinations that are probably universal and can happen everywhere. But are they the same in how they occur in terms of their meaning? Definitely not. Now we know. And there are different ways that they can be shaped by society. There's also the notion that perhaps these disorders don't evolve in the same ways in third world versus in westernized society. And that was one of the explanations for that. I mean, it's been contested, but still, there's been a thinking that those disorders seem to evolve a bit better in developing societies because of the social network, because of the importance of people around you will be there. Whereas in more individualized society, well, you don't fit the norm and you're not able to sustain yourself, then perhaps the outcome would be better. At the same level, we can think of populations. I work with Inuit populations, and there's a thinking that perhaps at some point having hallucinations could actually be valued or something, the sense that you were able to perceive things that other people could not perceive. So yes, it shows that there's definitely discrepancies in how you can...
Sorry, There are several people that do various types of work that go to particular cultures and try and uncover this. And certainly when I spend a little bit of time in South Africa, I spent some time with sangomas, with healers, and asked them about how do they deal with this, how do they, and I think probably at the lower levels and some parts of disorder that they revere that and they see that in certain ways, but they were still quite clear that there are, at the more extreme end, what we would call very acute, schizophrenia, where someone really can't, they're so unwell that they really can't get up and actually wash themselves, and they really struggle to speak. They become almost mute. It's very extreme. That their kind of result of that was, I'm just going to send that to the white doctor, because that person doesn't fit. They don't fit even within a church community or a healing community where people are encouraged to speak in tongues or hear voices. They still look unusual compared to those particular practices. So I think that's probably still at the extreme end, something that's probably does fit across cultures, but it's something we really need to be clearer about. And we certainly can't necessarily go in and transplant our interventions in medicine in the same kind of way.
Okay, question here at the front.
So you've all spoken about the root causes of psychosis, but can you say anything about how your research can potentially lead to benefits in treatment when it's already diagnosed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably slightly less relevant to that. And I mean, I guess the work I'm doing, because I'm trying to look at the lower end of the spectrum, and particularly in kids, the idea of what I'm interested in is, can we detect some of the signs that someone's going to become unwell before they become unwell, before they even have lower level symptoms, let alone disorder? I think one of the recurring themes, particularly for schizophrenia, is that it's very difficult to treat it. We know that maybe a quarter of people will have it and then actually recover from it fully and get on and live their lives, but a lot of people will have a very chronic disabling condition, and we can throw some very indiscriminate, if you like, medication at them that will have a lot of other effects and not kind of dull what's happening rather than resolve it. And we can bring in lots of other types of interventions, but once people have it, it's even the process of getting it and developing it, because it can happen over a few years. I mean, it takes a long time to detect it and get into healthcare, can have quite devastating effects. They've already been out of employment for a while, or fallen out with all their family and had a lot of other problems. So I don't think our research necessarily informs what happens afterwards, and there's a general trend in the field to try and move towards, can we prevent it, because we know it's quite difficult to treat. So I don't know that mine necessarily helps, but I don't know if you...
Yeah, we focused a bit what we talked, I guess, on the social causes, and definitely there are many things that might need to be done at a social level to prevent, but I'm still very much a clinician, and as I was doing my interviews, I was a researcher, but there's still a clinician in me kind of listening to that and asking people what they were thinking, what they felt was helpful or would have been helpful to them. So I had that consideration, and there were a few things that they said. One of them is, actually, many people have told me that the qualitative interview, the research process in itself, they thought had been helpful. They said that, and there's some literature on that being able to make sense of your life experience, of your illness, and the fact that they were able to piece together some parts of their life with the illness, that they could suddenly express it, and the fact that I was perhaps providing a space for them to make sense of this, and the very act of listening and eliciting that. So many people have said something like, thank you, this was therapeutic, or thank you, or I wish this is what they had done when I went to the hospital in the first place. So many people have said things on those lines. The other thing that they've said, some have just said, that they helped me just because they looked me first as a human being. So they attended first to the human before the illness or the symptoms, and focusing on addressing the environmental circumstances. It seemed that the most therapeutic was when you put the emphasis on that. Like you need to have a roof. You need to gain back your dignity as a human. Before talking about medications and stopping the voices, the voice can be there. They can still be paranoid, but they will agree that they need a roof first, or that they need to get back into society, or repair some of the broken relationships. So I think that emphasis in care, which is not quite there yet, but the more there was that, and that is improving a little bit with the early intervention for psychosis. I think it's going towards there, but that's really what seems to be the most important for minority populations. And the other thing that they said sometimes that could have prevented that, or looking backwards, some have said about having some kind of a cultural mentor, or someone from their own culture or background that they could identify with, or that they could, someone that they could have related to describe some of their experience. Because many of those people have very unstable family environment, and I think they would have needed some kind of a confidant, essentially, someone that they could have trust and see themselves in.
I mean, I guess the other thing to say is that obviously looking at the social factors in terms of actually predicting it starting, it means that also that those factors are things that are likely to either maintain those experiences over time or exacerbate them. So often people with psychosis will have periods where they're acutely unwell, but then they'll go through a recovery period, and as I say, some people will just not have it, but a lot of people will have episodic experiences where they're okay for a while and then become unwell again. And often what triggers them becoming unwell is a social stressor. So if we know that social stressors in particular environments are going to trigger the experience in the first place, they're probably, and people have shown they're also likely to re-trigger it again. And the more you have it, obviously, the more distressing it is, and the more difficult it is to keep your quality of life. So I think what it does tell us is that we need to, once someone's become unwell as well, we need to try and reduce as much stress as we can on what's happening. But that's tough, because you do want people to go back to work, and that can be stressful.
Kelly, I know you were involved in early intervention work in Ontario. This is quite a new field for many people, so I just wonder if it would be helpful to outline the role of early intervention psychosis services and how they actually can speak to this idea of treatment, because I think they're quite important.
Yeah, sure. So we actually have really good evidence that if you can detect cases of psychotic illness early and reduce the length of time that these psychotic symptoms go untreated, that it actually translates to better outcomes for people later on down the road. So I think a lot of what our work highlights is groups who are at risk of psychotic illness, so that if we're trying to target some of these secondary prevention efforts, that we can target them to groups who are at highest risk of developing, potentially detecting these cases a little bit earlier and getting them into these early intervention services, which provide very intensive services for those sort of crucial early stages of illness, when a person's illness trajectory can be more, is very defined in that first 2-year period.
Okay, a few more questions to go. Did you have a question behind? Yeah.
Regarding the twin study, could you tell us how often you had instances where both twins developed psychosis versus this discordant situation where only one twin developed?
So as I said earlier, it's much more common for them both to have it. It was slightly less likely actually with these symptoms because they're at a much lower level. So the genetic component is a bit less. It's not quite as clear-cut as for something like schizophrenia. So it occurs more commonly in both but when they're genetically identical.
But you don't have an idea of
how you're going to try and give me the number? Okay.
Yeah, approximately.
So, all right. So in the whole sample, we have 126 individuals. So out of 2,000, we have 126 who have the symptoms at 12. And of those, we have, I'm just trying to work it out. So we have, oh, it is going to be hard for me now. I'm just trying to do my maths. So we have about 30 pairs who are discordant, and therefore we have, oh no, this is really bad. So we have about, so we have about 40 pairs where they have it together, and probably about 25 actually where they have discordant. So actually it is more common, but at that point in time, it's not hugely different actually between.
And did you look at the time course? Like, did the discordant one become
more
accordant?
So we follow them at 18. For most of the kids, it's disappeared, so that's very common. So those psychotic symptoms early, there seem to be almost a developmental hiccup, probably around brain maturation and hormonal change. So for most of them, it's gone. So I think we only have, so there are about 50 kids at 18 who have them, but of those, I think only 20 of them are kids who had them at 12. So for most of them, if they were discordant, it kind of continues, but normally what happens is they become concordant for not having them. So we get a few more cases during adolescence. So it's still relatively rare phenomena in this population. But what we've shown in other studies where we follow not twins, but just general population samples into kind of middle adulthood, is that those kids who have those psychotic symptoms at 12, even if they were at greater risk of having schizophrenia later, but they're also at greater risk of things like PTSD and substance misuse and suicide as well. So it seems to be a bit of a marker for something that's not quite going right early on.
We will take some more questions. Yeah.
I'm trying to throw this.
So, yeah, thank you. So I would like to ask quite a difficult question, maybe even provocative. So you've indicated the kind of the traumatic experiences that can impact the outcome, right? And of course, they've been with humanity for a long time, like many years of development and advancement. So one of my questions is how much of that is a new phenomenon, and how much has been with us all the time? And my second and more provocative part would also be maybe, is there any indication or research that some of these disorders might actually have some kind of evolutionary advantage even? Can it be a reaction against something which could have a positive effect almost?
I'll take the second one quickly. The evidence is really mixed on that. It is very controversial. We assume that, I think there's a general assumption that there must be something evolutionary about it, otherwise why are they still here? They've been, the certain of psychotic symptoms have been documented for a very, very long time, and they don't seem to have died out. There's some suggestion that some people with other types of psychosis, like bipolar disorder, that there's greater creativity linked to some of these psychotic phenomena, this ability to perceive things slightly differently and think about things in a different way. But the evidence is pretty mixed about what that advantage is. I don't know if
there's a theory by quite an eminent psychiatrist called Tim Crow, who has proposed that schizophrenia is the price that humans pay for the development of language and higher order cognitive processes. So there was a lateralization of the brain, as far as I understand it, and that somehow that connectivity goes wrong for a proportion of people who he sort of very eloquently and poetically said that was the price that they took the burden of mental illness for the fact that we can all then enjoy these higher order processes. Again, I don't know the evidence to support that. It's almost a romanticized view of what might be going on. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that.
It's perhaps more anecdotal, but again, so you mentioned something about creativity, and yes, there's that discussion overlap, not necessarily about schizophrenia, but it's definitely the notion that I train also as a musician, and some of the greatest composer we know I've suffered and would probably have been diagnosed with at the very least disorders like bipolar disorders and yeah, probably psychotic illnesses as well. And does it mean it was pathological? It's a different way. Perhaps it had some advantage at some level. It probably still came with some suffering, and in some cases with death by suicide. There's, again, I just mentioned the notion in some societies, like in Inuit populations, and that perhaps some people who were having these phenomena were more likely to be seen as different, or could be the shaman, as they might be able to perceive things. And so we say it's a disorder of salience right now, so attributing excessive meaning to things, but perhaps there's some level of meaning which can be protective in some societies. It might not be in a westernized world, but I think we can think of it in that way. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I think in terms of your first question, because I feel we left that bit out about we've had trauma around for a long time, and yeah. Is trauma more common now? I think probably different types of trauma are more common. I think with abuse, I think it's been around a long time, and people just talk about it now. I don't think the prevalence changes necessarily that much. I think we just have more types of stress, and there are more wars and more things going on, but I think people would have had different stresses. I think how we look at the outcomes of those just has differed over time. So even with something like PTSD is a very recent diagnostic label, but things like shell shock and things were around before. We just didn't call them the same thing. Schizophrenia and psychotic symptoms have been around for a very long time. And historically, in the last century, people did, in the kind of 1950s, raise, or in fact even Freud, if you want to go back even further, talked a lot about dysfunction within families, and particularly between mother and child, and the difficulties with that relating to schizophrenia. And not surprisingly, that was a little unpopular with mothers and families. But we kind of, and then we have the rise of kind of biological forms of psychiatry and meanings around that. So people didn't look at it, and people start now to go back to social construction. So I think part of it's about fashion within psychiatric ways of thinking about things and ways that we label things and define things. And also we have to appreciate that people live longer now. A lot of these people may have previously, a lot of people in the past would have been locked up for a variety of things, or they would have died through malnutrition or through suicide or something else. So we're kind of more aware of things now, I think.
Now we've reached Freud.
Yeah, so Freud is a dangerous.
And we've got 43 seconds
Whoa.
left. I think there's a couple more questions I'd like to get to, or one more at least, from someone over here, perhaps.
All right, I'll try 43 seconds. Huh? There's actually a really interesting phenomenon with both Canada and definitely within the United States, that you have almost two systems in many ways of healthcare. You have the native populations and you have the general population. I'm less familiar with Canada, but the United States is having fascinating problems with healthcare right now. One side effect of which is that a lot of the non-Indigenous population is ending up in Indigenous population healthcare. Because of the overrun that is happening on the doctors, or on the healthcare system that just has happened because of the population. And so I've had this happen to friends or various things where they were treated by one doctor somewhere and then they moved and there was no space for them, and so they ended up with an Indigenous population and started getting completely different advice and types of treatment coming out of different approaches. And as a data set, I'm really curious where that's going, or if we're looking into that, or if there's anything we can get out of that that is informative of some of these things.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about the American system to know. I don't know how that data is, whether you could even collect that data. I think it would be very difficult to collect. I know they have just done the first, what Kelly was talking about earlier, the first kind of early intervention, which is kind of integrated comprehensive treatment model in the US. They've just published on it. It's the first time they try to get different systems in healthcare together to do that, and it was successful, not surprisingly. But yeah, I don't know. It would be very interesting to know how that.
Speaking about westernized kind of care, or having treatment, you're not talking about traditional healers. You're talking about.
Both. Yeah, well, because you can actually be funded. So, yeah, the traditional healthcare within the United States is still healthcare. It's just run by the Native American population, and so you can get funding through that if you're through Obamacare. Will fund someone who wants to get that type of treatment.
I'm not very familiar about this, or an equivalent in our healthcare system. What I would say is that we do have some examples, but they're relatively few. Like there's a clinic in Toronto, which where we'll have that the first layer of care, but it's really designed for Aboriginal populations, and their first line of access will be through Aboriginal healers and various types, and really the westernized kind of medical care is really in the backup. But we have a very different healthcare system than the United States. I mean, I think here already it's quite a universal healthcare, so I'm not sure we would observe the same sort of